This channel exists because of Final Fantasy VII. For anyone who's spent even a modicum of time watching my videos, that might come off as a blatantly incorrect statement. After all, Zelda is where this channel started, right? Well, from the outside looking in, yes, that does appear to be entirely true. My first video was published on March 15th, 2021, and that was a review of the original Legend of Zelda for the NES. Except, one small problem, The Legend of Zelda was not the first game I wrote a review for. It was the second. That's right, it was not originally my intention to become a Zelda-themed channel, as the Octorok branding, my channel banner, and the general proclivity of Zelda-related review content seems to indicate. Instead, the very first game I intended to make a video for was Final Fantasy VII, a game with zero gameplay or thematic ties to the original Zelda. Naturally, you're probably thinking to yourself by this point, why? Why was Final Fantasy VII, a game I've spent zero time talking about in the last 2.5 years I've been making videos, the first game that I wrote a review for? Well, because Final Fantasy VII was the game that opened my eyes to the complexity of the art form that is the video game medium. No, I am not joking. I mean that with all my heart, and that's not based on any personal bias of mine. I don't have some kind of complex, nostalgic connection to this game or anything like that. I first played it when I was 21 years old, and I didn't grow up on PlayStation or Final Fantasy in general either. Hell, the first time I even played a Final Fantasy game was when I was about 19, and that was the original on the NES. I've since played all the titles up until 8, which is the worst game I've ever played, no joke, and for reference, I only really enjoyed playing 3 of them. But 7 is different. So much of this game's soul and identity survives into the present era. Whenever a developer or seasoned veteran of gaming talks about 7, they treat it with such reverence and respect. Nothing about any of the other Final Fantasy games has managed to reach that kind of cultural ubiquity, aside from 13's crappiness and 10's, well, this. All of that is to say that Final Fantasy VII is a well-beloved game, and it generally ranks amongst the most influential and well-respected video games of all time. And after having replayed this game every year for the past 4 years, and spending the last 3 years building up to this review, I can definitively say that it deserves every bit of that respect and reverence and more. It's not a perfect game. Oh no, it has its problems, particularly in the late game, and we'll address those for sure. But in its totality, Final Fantasy VII is one of the greatest games I have ever played, masterfully balancing a beautiful story full of wonderful character writing, well-crafted themes, and genuinely deep and thought-provoking philosophies the likes of which you'll scarcely find anywhere else. And it complements that tale with a robust gameplay loop and a fantastically designed game world. So, finally, after 3 years of trying to make this video. What's up? I'm Octorok Reviews, and this is my 7-hour Final Fantasy VII review. We're gonna be talking about everything. Graphics, gameplay, writing, pacing, all in the pursuit of understanding just what makes this game the legendary title that it is. Final Fantasy VII originally began development as just another Final Fantasy sequel. To explain what I mean by that, let me give you a quick history lesson regarding the Final Fantasy series. The first game in the franchise, published in December of 1987, was an extremely creative title made in a desperate bid to save the developer, Squaresoft, from bankruptcy. After it launched, sales for the fledgling game series were stellar, and because the company really didn't have an independent identity by this point, they decided to just haphazardly roll out a sequel the following year, followed by another one, and another one, and another one, until by April of 1994, we're already at Final Fantasy VI. On average, that's one Final Fantasy game every year and 3 weeks, and boy did it show in the final products. The first 5 Final Fantasy sequels are either kinda shitty and very long, or really short but kinda good, and the game's stories are all wholly unoriginal. Find 4 crystals, kill 4 mini-bosses, kill the final boss, you win. That was Final Fantasy I's game structure, and every game after that just ripped it off. Sure, 4 added in some interesting ideas, traveling to the moon, inklings of individual character stories, etc., but the writing quality was shoddy for the most part. Final Fantasy VI was the first game to finally branch away from the monotony of that first title's plot structure, but even so, the gameplay is horrendous. The pacing is awful, and the writing is just ugh. Okay, Octo, we get it. You hate Final Fantasy VI, the one that everyone else loves. So, what's my point here? Well, for the first 6 games, Final Fantasy was treated like nothing more than a yearly franchise by its development studio. But not by the game designers themselves, mind you. Hironobu Sakaguchi and his team loved what they were doing, and genuinely wanted to create good games. There's no doubt about that. But the company's financial woes up until that first game's release had left a noticeable scar in the company, one that forced the developers to sit within a tight, inescapable, yearly deadline meant to bring in cash for the company. And exacerbating that caged-in attitude was the fact that the gaming industry in general, and developers especially, felt, well, rather caged in by Nintendo, whose strict publishing requirements and quality assurance no doubt ate into Squaresoft's yearly profits. Final Fantasy had been exclusively released on Nintendo's hardware since its inception, after all. But what was Square going to do about it? Switch to Sega? That came with its own associated risks, the foremost of which being that Sega had a notoriously weak lineup of RPGs, and therefore RPG-playing customers. If only there were a new competitor on the market, one which already had a massive amount of capital at its disposal, and would be willing to offer insanely lucrative publishing deals to third-party developers like Squaresoft, in an effort to wedge their way into the video game industry.
$2.99.
The Sony PlayStation. Oh man, was this console the shit. I mean, I never had it as a kid or anything. We were a ride-or-die Sega household for sure. But as a grown-ass man playing all these games for the first time, I gotta tell ya, I now understand why all the kids at school had PlayStations and not the fucking Sega Saturn. But the incredible catalog of games the PlayStation had would not have been possible without an equally impressive set of hardware. And boy did the PlayStation have it. When compared to the N64, anyway. How so? I mean, we can talk specs all day. 17 million colors, 32-bit processor, yada yada, but that's not what mattered at all to developers. If it did, then frankly, the N64 would have been the better console to develop for, since it had the better specs all around. No. What mattered the most, funnily enough, is the most obvious difference between the two consoles. Have you spotted it yet? Go ahead, take your time. It's the big fucking cartridge sticking out of the N64. Yes, that was the biggest problem with this console, I am not joking. It might seem ridiculous nowadays, especially when you consider the fact that the Nintendo Switch uses cartridges, and it's managed to outsell both the PS4 and PS5. But this was actually a huge deal back in the 90s, because nowadays, developers seem to give zero fucks if their 200GB game takes up 80% of your console's data storage, because everything's downloaded now. Game data isn't being held on these cartridges or discs so much as it's being shared, with the console's local storage taking on the brunt of that labor. And if you download your games, then there's zero need to worry about data storage at all from the developer's end. Fuck your console, we'll brick that shit with our 50GB day one patch, we don't care. Needless to say, technology has come a long way since the 90s, and it's turned every developer into an asshole. But in 1994, this shit really mattered, because there's a hard limit to the amount of data that you can fit in cartridges, which, by the way, are way more expensive to produce than your average ROM CD. Whereas the PlayStation's utilization of memory cards, the very first attempt at an in-console data storage, allowed developers to not only fit in a lot more data into a much cheaper package, but to also utilize multiple discs if necessary, essentially eliminating the data cap that cartridges have. Your 100-hour epic JRPG might be too big to fit on an N64 cartridge, but the PlayStation's got you covered there. Just ship the game in 2, 3, hell, even 4 separate discs, and just have the player switch them out every 20 hours or so. Not only was this cheaper than shipping a game on an N64 cartridge, but it also allowed for more creative freedom on the developer's part, since data storage was now only limited by how many discs could fit into the box, which developers just got around by simply making bigger boxes. So Square was at a crossroads here. Do we stick with good old reliable Nintendo and just push out another yearly sequel for a console with major hardware limitations? Or do we take the risky path? Do we boldly launch ourselves off a cliff with Sony and pray to God that their new console can fly? In other words, do we stick to what we know and just push out another Final Fantasy game? Or do we go back to the series' roots, and take a deep dive into risky artistry? The answer was clear to Sakaguchi and his team, and with Sony offering to partially finance the next entry in the Final Fantasy series, so too did it become clear to the company's executives. As part of Sony's big push to legitimize themselves as a major gaming company, Final Fantasy VII would go on to become the most expensive video game ever made up until its release in 1997, and would be developed by a team comprising somewhere between 100 and 150 people, the largest dev team to ever work on a video game before. These were insane numbers by mid-90s standards. If you watched my last video, you might recall that only some 24 people in total worked on Super Mario 64. And that game came out only the year before Final Fantasy VII. So where did this new influx of money and manpower go? Everywhere. This game is goddamn gorgeous. Graphics age, sure, but everything in its proper context. By 1997 standards, these graphics were the shit, and art direction is timeless. This game does such a perfect job making its settings, characters, and animations fit together in a way that not only adds believability to the story, but also fits in with the game's overarching themes. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. We'll talk more about art later. The reason I bring it up, though, is because the lead character designer, a formerly unknown artist working on Final Fantasy VI, was also one of the head writers for this game. For those of you who watched my last two reviews, I know this is eerily similar to Yoshiaki Koizumi. I've reviewed 3 games in a row now where a little-known artist ends up becoming a lead developer and writer on a future game in the series he drew for. It's a very strange coincidence. Anyway, this artist's name was... oh god. Okay, for those of you who don't know who this is, Tetsuya Nomura is a game director and writer who holds a very terrible reputation in the gaming industry. That's because everything he's touched since Final Fantasy VII has been complete garbage. He's like the M. Night Shyamalan of video game directors. But I think it's important to bring him up now because Final Fantasy VII, miraculously, does not have a trash fire story, as one might expect from a game partially written by this man. His contributions to the team were mostly the big picture ideas. Sephiroth was his idea, the party chasing after a villain across the planet was his idea, Cloud and Aeris as character concepts were originally his idea. He contributed a lot of raw, unrefined ideas to the rest of the team, who then made them work within the context of a fully written story. And speaking of which, working alongside Nomura as co-writer and producer was Hironobu Sakaguchi, the man who made the original Final Fantasy, as well as the lead designer and producer of the first 9 games in the franchise, this one included. The original draft for Final Fantasy VII was completely his work, but as various interviews over the years have revealed, his original story had almost nothing to do with the end product. Still, the overall themes of the story and its arguably most important plot points were all his ideas, and Sakaguchi is probably just being humble about his role from what I've gathered. He took Aeris and gave her a proper role in the story. He made up the character of Tifa entirely from scratch. He came up with the initial concept of a dystopian, capitalist dictatorship run from a filthy urban center, which would eventually become the main setting of the game's first 5 hours. Sakaguchi gave the plot structure and refined many of Tetsuya Nomura's wilder ideas. These are our co-writers for the story. But they're not the script writers. The moment-to-moment scenes and dialogue were primarily written by 2 other men, Kazushige Nojima and Yoshinori Kitase. To be honest, from what I've read, Nojima did practically all the legwork while Yoshinori was working on a completely different game called Heracles no Eikyo 3. Also, Kitase was the game's director, so I'm sure he was busy with all that as well. Can't really blame him. Together, these 2 men wrote the majority of the game's actual story, scenarios, and weaved Nomura and Sakaguchi's original plot points into the gameplay seamlessly. Nojima worked tirelessly to fit actual characters into the story as well, something that Nomura and Sakaguchi are both quite terrible at writing, and find ways to weave each party member's stories into the main narrative and themes of the game. Nomura then designed the characters to match their newly written personalities and backstories, while also making them look distinct and eye-catching. Finally, there was one last uncredited writer who polished the final product, Masato Kato. He wrote several key scenes. Actually, he wrote 2 of the very best scenes in the whole game, with the purpose of wrapping up key character stories and plot points. These 5 men were the collective geniuses behind Final Fantasy VII. Without them, this game never would have existed. Sure, we still would have gotten a Final Fantasy VII, a different game with the same title, just another Final Fantasy sequel, as I said before. But Final Fantasy VII, the Final Fantasy VII only exists because a very special team full of incredibly gifted designers, artists, and producers who worked simultaneously as the game's writers managed to come together and create a seamless product. That's why Final Fantasy VII is so special. Keep these names in mind as we go forward with the video because they'll pop up again every now and then. So without further ado, let's take a deep dive into this game and look upon the fruits of these labors, starting, as always, with its beginning. I'm sure I don't need to tell you this, since you just watched it for yourself, but I'll say it anyway. The opening of Final Fantasy VII should be the textbook example of exactly how to pull off an establishing shot in visual storytelling. Right off the bat, everything the player needs to know about the setting is conveyed. The story takes place in the dystopian nightmare of Midgar, a city of great wealth and terrible poverty, of modern conveniences and the burdens of industrialization. It's either the best or worst place in the world to live, and the only thing separating those two extremes is how much money you possess. It's simultaneously awe-inspiring and gut-wrenching, a testament to mankind's progress and pettiness. Basically, it's LA. And that's not entirely a joke, because the team that designed Midgar was actually based in Los Angeles. And I gotta tell ya, as a SoCal native, it's pretty spot on. But we're not made to linger on these impressions for very long. Just as quickly as we were pulled out from the city for our establishing shot, we're pulled back in, this time to a train station near one of the city's many reactors. And out pops our heroes. At least, that's what we're made to think at first. Yes, this purple dude called Ex-Soldier is indeed our protagonist, but as we soon find out, he and his crew aren't exactly doing hero's work. They're terrorists, eco-terrorists to be exact, belonging to a group called AVALANCHE. Obviously, that's a hard subject to broach. It's a challenge to take a cast of characters who kill people for political reasons and then make them the heroes, especially when the cause is so divisive. But Final Fantasy VII pulls it off brilliantly. First and foremost, the player character, Cloud, is actually just a mercenary working for the terrorists. He kills people, sure, but for money rather than a politically charged cause. And in a dystopian hellhole like Midgar, it's perhaps a bit understandable why someone might be offering mercenary services in exchange for cash. He's hardly any different from the professional soldiers working for the enemy, which, as it turns out, he was actually one of them before becoming a mercenary. Cloud himself comes off as politically neutral, allowing players to decide for themselves how they feel about what our main cast is doing at the very start of the game. The other heroes, on the other hand, are not quite so neutral. Jesse, Wedge, and Biggs, the foot soldiers, are all for the cause, and their leader, Barrett, is the most dedicated of them all. His zealotry is even cleverly used as a diegetic way of providing exposition to the player. He explains the evil deeds of Shinra, the energy corporation that runs Midgar, as being purely for profit, and that Mako reactors like the one we're about to blow up are sucking the planet dry, actively killing the world around us. It works because clearly he believes it. This isn't out of character for Barrett at all, as we'll soon see. Throughout the game, he constantly justifies his actions as being for the good of the planet, and there's a reason for that, which we'll discover as we learn more about his character. He isn't monologuing here simply to give the player story information, though yes, that is what this dialogue accomplishes. He's doing it to justify his cause and get Cloud to believe in it, showing frustration at what he believes to be Cloud's cold indifference towards the plight of the planet. It's a smart way to open up our tale, quickly and effectively providing context for the player's actions. But more than just the story, this opening sequence manages to succeed from a gameplay perspective as well. Right off the bat, we're introduced to our very first battle with these two Shinra soldiers. You're given 3 options: fight, magic, and item. Cloud starts off with 2 spells, Ice and Lightning, and a massive sword to swing around. As you'll find out with a bit of experimentation, many Shinra-affiliated enemies, particularly the robots, are weak to lightning, one of your 2 starting spells. It's a nice little reward for players who take the time to explore Cloud's attacks instead of just spamming the circle button to attack over and over again. Soon enough, Barrett joins up with Cloud, giving the player his first party of 2 characters. Barrett's character design suggests that he's the tank, which is a mostly true assumption, given that he starts with high attack and defense stats with 0 magic skills. The battle system itself is a carryover from the previous 3 Final Fantasy titles. It uses an active time battle system, meaning that there are no hard set turns like you might find in Dragon Quest or Pokemon. Rather, each unit in the battle has an action gauge, which fills over time, the speed of which is affected by a character's dexterity stat. The higher the dexterity, the faster it fills. This allows party members to attack whenever they're ready, instead of simply having to wait until the enemy has had their turn. This can allow the player's party members, or the enemy party even, to attack 1, 2, maybe even 3 times before the enemy gets their turn in, which makes speed builds a lot more viable than they might otherwise be in a traditional turn-based combat system. Other than that, combat is pretty standard. Characters use a wide assortment of magic spells that can inflict or cure status effects, do elemental damage, heal or revive party members, increase or decrease speed stats, buff defenses, the whole 9 yards. But there is one key addition to Final Fantasy VII's combat system that sets it apart from its peers: the Materia system. In most turn-based RPGs, the Final Fantasy series included, a character's role in combat is determined by 2 things: their base stats and their class. The class is often indicative of these stats as well, so really class is the main thing you'll have to look at when figuring out new combat roles in an RPG. Some common classes in the Final Fantasy series include the Warrior, a physical attacking unit with good defense who utilizes a great assortment of weapons. The White Mage, or Healer, who uses magic to heal party members but can't attack or defend particularly well. The Thief, who benefits from a high speed stat and can acquire otherwise unobtainable items through thievery. The Dragoon, a speedy attacker who utilizes spears and jumping techniques. The Paladin, who wields healing magic on top of a high attack and defense stat. The Black Mage, who casts powerful attack magic but isn't really good at anything else. The Summoner, who summons magical creatures to do the fighting for them. So on and so on it goes. In case you couldn't tell, there are generally way too many classes to choose from in Final Fantasy games, and there is often a fair amount of overlap between them as a result. For example, in Final Fantasy VI, there were 14 goddamn characters to choose from, also that the player could have a decent pick of character classes in order to customize his party makeup. But what this means is that if you like a particular character, like, say, Locke, but he has a useless class, like, say, Walk, then you can't use him without taking massive penalties in combat, which isn't a problem in Final Fantasy VI because the combat is mind-numbingly easy, but that's besides the point. Of course, you could, in contrast to 6, just give the player a set cast of characters with 0 option to change them out, like Final Fantasy IV did, and then simply make sure they're balanced throughout the entire game. That was rather easy in 4's case because that game is only 15 hours long, with 100% completion as well. But as a drawback, it completely takes away the player's ability to customize their character's classes and strategies. You're always going to have one summoner, one white mage, one ninja, one paladin, and one dragoon at the end of Final Fantasy IV. You have no say in the matter, and that adversely affects the game's replay value. So how does Final Fantasy VII fix this issue? One word: materia. Materia are round gemstones made of compressed Mako energy, the same stuff that powers the reactors in Midgar. For story reasons that we have yet to discuss, they have the power to grant people access to magic, new abilities, and increased physical stamina and prowess. In terms of gameplay, that essentially means that materia are the keys to which a character can unlock new abilities. Take Cloud, for example. Remember how I said that he has access to a lightning and ice spell? That's because he starts equipped with two magic materia: ice and lightning. There's a limit to how much materia any one character can equip at a time, based on the number of materia slots available through a character's weapons and armor. Because once you remove a piece of materia, bam, that skill is gone. Cloud needs to have an ice and lightning materia equipped to use both of these spells in combat. For that reason, a piece of materia tracks its experience points, or AP, separately from each party member. If you equip a level 3 lightning materia on Cloud, remove it, then give it to Barret, the materia's provided skills remain the same. The only difference is in which character has access to using it. But because the damage of these spells is affected by one's magic skill, there is a level of strategy to how you arrange your character's materia. Giving Cloud's lightning materia to Barret is generally a bad move, because he has the worst magic stats in the game, though there are exceptions to that rule. It all depends on how you choose to build these characters throughout the game, but simple spell materia is only one type amongst many. There's command materia, which adds special skills like stealing, mugging, morphing, multi-hit combos, and many more. There's summon materia, which grants access to summons that cast devastating but costly super spells. There's independent materia, which does a wide assortment of things, raising stats, providing buffs, adding passive abilities, etc. Finally, but quite crucially, we have support materia. You can pair these types of materias with others to add special effects. For example, if we attach an all materia to our lightning materia, the spell now attacks all the enemies in front of us instead of just one. Or you can attach an elemental materia to make Cloud resistant to lightning damage, or a quadra magic materia to use that spell 4 times in a single turn. And of course, you can mix and match any number of materia to create all sorts of custom builds for your characters. Experimentation is highly encouraged and deeply rewarded. As you can probably tell based on my rather positive tone thus far, the materia system works brilliantly, and I think it's an absolute shame that I've never seen another game use it since. It allows for such a robust and deeply customizable combat system. I don't think I've ever seen another turn-based RPG create a class system that's anything quite like it. Every playthrough of Final Fantasy VII I've experienced has been slightly different because of it. I've tried out so many different builds, using so many different combinations of characters, weapons, gear, and materia over the years that, legitimately, I believe this system is at least 90% of the reason why I find this game so rewarding to replay over and over again. The story's brilliant, sure, and the choices you make matter, and obviously that adds a lot of replay value in and of itself. But if the moment-to-moment gameplay weren't this robust, then none of that would matter. This is a video game, not a movie, after all. It is, therefore, the materia system that really holds this entire game together at its foundation, and I have to give it big props for that. But getting back to the opening. In the depths of the reactor, we are met with our very first boss, the Guard Scorpion. Like many of the other enemies in this section of the game, the Scorpion is weak to lightning damage, rewarding players who experiment with the magic skill. This is the first fight in the game that will require genuine strategy, as any good turn-based RPG's boss fight should. He has a total of 800 hit points, while Cloud and Barret only hit for about 35 hit points with physical attacks, and 80 with Cloud's lightning. So you're going to have to survive several hits from this thing, and a quick way to fail in that pursuit is by not paying attention to when it goes into defensive mode and prepare some devastating counterattacks. Now, I would be remiss if I did not mention that the translators made a big typo here and accidentally had Cloud tell Barret to hit the Scorpion when its tail is up, instead of something like, don't hit the Scorpion when its tail is up. As far as I can tell, this is the only major typo in the game, and it's right here at the beginning for some reason. I don't know why. There are some minor ones sprinkled throughout, but none are as game-changing as this one. Obviously, this is a problem exclusive to the original international PS1 release, but, well, that's the version I'm reviewing, so yeah, it's unfortunate. Regardless, the fight itself is a really effective combat tutorial. Since it's designed to drag on for several turns, and because the Scorpion hits rather hard, this will almost undoubtedly be the very first fight to introduce the player to limit breaks. The limit breaks were Tetsuya Nomura's idea, and they're awesome. Essentially, each character has a bar called a limit gauge, which fills up as they take damage. How much the bar fills depends on how much health they lost in proportion to their total health bar. For example, if Barret loses 250 HP when he has only 261, then that's absolutely a full limit gauge right there. Now, if he lost 250 HP out of a total of 1000, then it's only going to fill up maybe a third of the limit gauge. When the gauge is full, the affected character is allowed to use a special move called a limit break. These are essentially individualized techniques which allow a character to unleash an ultimate attack that can turn the tide of any battle. In this opening section, Cloud's limit break is Braver, which does 3 times the damage of his normal attack command, and Barret's is Big Shot, which does 3¼ times his normal damage. As an added bonus, a character using a limit break receives move priority, allowing him or her to attack immediately. Limit breaks are freaking great. They not only add a lot of depth to each boss battle, but they also add flares of individuality to each member of your party. After killing the Scorpion, Cloud will set the bomb, and the player now has to escape from the reactor in less than 10 minutes. This is more than achievable, but you won't really know that on your first playthrough, so it adds a lot of tension to the frantic retread of the facility you'll have to do in order to escape the explosion. Along the way, you'll have to save one of the terrorists from danger to escape, and then the facility explodes. After a quick debriefing, the party splits up, and for the very first time, the player is given free reign to walk the streets of Midgar alone. We see the aftermath of our destruction. People are frightened, scattering and leaving the surrounding area abandoned. A colorfully dressed flower girl approaches and asks what's going on. You can choose to play it cool and speak to her, which can earn a prompt to purchase one of her flowers, or warn her that the area is not safe and that she should leave, advice which she shall appreciate and quickly follow through on. Eventually, we meet up again with the other members of Avalanche. Jesse, the group's explosives expert, gives Cloud, and therefore the player, a quick rundown on the structure of the city. It's split into 8 sectors, with each having a top half, where the people of wealth and affluence live atop the floating part of the city, and the bottom half, the slums, where we are now. No daylight can make it into these parts of the city. It is eternally night, the only source of light being artificial, conveniently powered by Shinra's Mako reactors. You can therefore presume that by destroying a reactor, we have also doomed an eighth of the city to complete and utter darkness. The weight of our actions today grows the more one thinks about it. While we're on the subject of Midgar, allow me to take a moment here to comment on the city design itself. Every nook and cranny of this fictional city is chock full of detail. Even after 25 years, the details in this environment simply have not aged. How the hell is this even possible? Pre-rendered backgrounds, that's how. This was a unique trait of the PS1 era that has since completely disappeared, and I think that's rather a shame, because there's really nothing quite like it in video games today. Essentially, a 3D modeler would go in and create the backgrounds for the game in a separate program, then take static 2D pictures of that finished product and send that over to the programmers who would then overlay 3D elements over the original 2D image, and bam! You have a low-memory solution for creating detailed backgrounds in early 3D video games. In an era where video game artists were just beginning to learn 3D modeling, this was a fantastic way to lower the workload of animated 3D content, while still creating detailed backgrounds that fit the look of the rest of the game. There are, however, a few disadvantages to this system. Primarily that you can only move the game's camera in 2 directions, the X and Y axes, while using pre-rendered assets, because the background is a static 2-dimensional image. This was a problem for action games like Resident Evil, a title whose controls famously suffered terribly due to these limitations. But luckily for Final Fantasy VII, this is literally not a problem at all, because movement in the game world takes place entirely on a 2D axis. It is a turn-based RPG, after all. Combat, by contrast, utilizes separate 3D modeled backgrounds, allowing for battles to take full advantage of 3D camera angles. This hybrid system is perhaps the best use of pre-rendered backgrounds I have ever seen in a video game. Sure, Resident Evil's backgrounds might look the best, but the gameplay suffers for it. Final Fantasy VII, on the other hand, manages to take full advantage of all of the benefits of the system, while suffering none of the drawbacks. A truly impressive feat, and one which reflects well on the game's art direction even a quarter century after its release. And Midgar, in particular, benefits massively from these pre-rendered backgrounds. I mentioned before that Midgar had its own dedicated team based in LA handling all the visuals, and boy does it show. Every inch and cranny of this city is brimming with detail, adding to the atmosphere and visual storytelling of the setting. The slums are full of broken down cars and machinery, long since stripped for parts, but left unswept, implying a lack of any city services operating in the poorer areas of Midgar. The roofs of each of the houses are constructed from welded assortments of old scrap metal, with zero uniformity or regulation as to how they are built. The road between sectors 5 and 6 has been neglected for so long that the potholes have turned into pot canyons. No one has even made an attempt at maintaining these roads for several decades at least. By stark contrast, the reactor we saw at the beginning of the game was clean, well constructed, and in perfect working order, implying that Shinra's protection only extends to the parts of the city which they believe will bring them profit. And when we finally see their headquarters a little later in the game, it's absolutely pristine. No expense has been spared in the construction and maintenance of this 70-story behemoth. The highways surrounding the Shinra building are also in perfect condition, in stark contrast to the state of the major roads we saw in the slums. There's a clear wealth disparity in this city, propagated in large part by the economic and technological growth of society, but ultimately perpetuated by the ineptitude and/or greed of those who run it. Can't imagine where the LA-based team got their ideas from. Obviously, there are some parts of the city's story that are directly told to the player. This earlier scene of dialogue on the train with Jesse and Barrett regarding Midgar is one such example. But the artwork and the game environment that envelops the space around the player really does most of the legwork in making this story believable. And that's a necessity for any game that relies so much on its environment for storytelling, like Final Fantasy VII does. The environment plays a major role in the plot and themes of the game, after all. You can't make a game with such a heavy emphasis on environmental storytelling, then ignore important details in said environment. Have you ever played a game where the characters are telling you one thing, but the actual game world is telling you another story entirely? Breath of the Wild is a great example of this. Bam! 30 minutes into the video and I finally hit you with the Breath of the Wild bashing. You've fallen for my trap. I bet you didn't think I'd fit it into the video this time, did ya? So what's my point here? Well, Breath of the Wild tries to tell its player base that Hyrule is a modern kingdom that was founded upon thousands of years of history, and that specifically 10,000 years ago, that very same kingdom was some great technological cyberpunk world with tablets and motorcycles and giant laser robots. But when you actually begin to interact with this supposedly ancient technology, it looks brand spanking new. Why are these 10,000-year-old elevators still operational? How are the robots still functioning perfectly and are still unrusted? What the fuck is powering any of this shit? It gets even worse when you factor in that only 100 years have passed since Ganon attacked, and somehow the stone structures from that period are in fucking shambles. That's not how any of this works. If you left a motorcycle in a garage unattended for 10,000 years. 1, it probably would not even exist by the time you unearth it. But 2, even if it was somehow still intact, it would most certainly not work anymore. Stone, on the other hand? Fuck, the pyramids are still standing and they're almost 10,000 years old, and they'll still be standing in another 10,000 years, barring any outside influence. In other words, the environmental storytelling of this game does not match up with the actual plot. If you cut all the dialogue out of Breath of the Wild and just let me explore the game world with zero explanation, my assumption would be that the Sheikah technology was brand new, built on top of the ruins of an ancient kingdom. But if you separate the game world from the storytelling, then it's supposed to be the reverse. The crumbling medieval kingdom is built atop brand new looking, yet somehow still ancient technology. What the fuck? The world of Breath of the Wild, the environment we explore throughout the game, does not match up with the storytelling. Instead, they conflict with each other. You cannot enjoy both at the same time, assuming you're playing the game with your brain turned on, because these two parts of the game stand in stark contrast to one another. It's like toothpaste and orange juice. Final Fantasy VII, by contrast, is the complete antithesis to Breath of the Wild's mistakes in that regard. The story and the game world work in perfect synchronization with one another. You know what kind of place this city is without anyone having to tell you. So as the plot goes on and we explore more and more of this wretched urban center, it'll all connect. You'll understand why Shinra doesn't wish to rebuild the Sector 7 slums, why Mako Energy and Shinra, by extension, rule this city, how the people who live in the slums could possibly be radicalized into forming terrorist cells like Avalanche. None of this would have been possible without the brilliant art direction of this game, and these kind of detailed environments will continue to bring the game world to life as we leave Midgar and explore the rest of the world. For real, 10 out of 10 art direction with this game. It's absolutely brilliant and adds so much to the collective experience of Final Fantasy VII. After getting off the train, we arrive in the Sector 7 slums, where Avalanche runs their organization from. We enter the local bar to find Cloud's childhood friend, Tifa, running the joint. She shows concern for Cloud, seeming to know about his criminal activities. Turns out she's also a member of Avalanche, perhaps further explaining Cloud's reasons for taking work from terrorists. He has a personal connection to one of them. If you bought a flower from the girl we met earlier, you can give it to either Tifa or Barrett's daughter Marlene, affecting what dialogue you experience for the rest of this scene. Just as a preface, yes, these choices actually do matter, and that's one of the many things I love about this game. As you just saw, our decision to speak to the flower girl already affected our options in this scene, and that trend will continue throughout the rest of the game. We'll talk about the nitty-gritty of these dialogue options and what parts of the story exactly they affect when it becomes relevant much later on. Cloud's almost ready to walk out on Avalanche once he gets his money, but Tifa begs him to stay, attempting to guilt Cloud by bringing up his childhood promises to protect her, our first indication of how far back their relationship goes. This works, but Cloud demands a raise in exchange, to which Barrett reluctantly agrees. This is how we receive our first lump sum of cash, with which we can purchase several items and gear before heading out of Sector 7. It's also at this point that Tifa formally joins our party. Tifa is a brawler, or monk as Final Fantasy traditionally calls characters who fight with their fists. She has good attack and dexterity skills, but lacks in magic and vitality. Still, she isn't as squishy as an assassin or mage character, pretty much making her a jack of all trades. Once the player feels as though he has sufficiently outfitted his now full party of 3 characters, he can head out from the Sector 7 train station and make his way to the 5th reactor. Along the way, a security check forces Cloud and Co. to jump off the train. If you're too slow, you'll have to fight train security and make your way through more of the subway tunnel than otherwise necessary. There are several scripted sections like this throughout Final Fantasy VII, quick events that change up the pacing of normal gameplay by having the player guide Cloud through a mechanical gauntlet in the Overworld. For the most part, they're fine. It's nothing game-changing, but it does at least shake things up and provide some much-needed variety to Overworld travel. Eventually, we make it to the Sector 5 reactor, plant the bomb with 0 resistance, and leave. As you might have guessed based on the simplicity of that description, this was all a trap. Shinra soldiers await at the entrance, and we are confronted by President Shinra himself. He knew Avalanche would be coming, and plans to use our own bomb to kill us. Cloud confronts the president like an old friend, and while the president does not remember Cloud specifically, he does recognize the hue of his eyes. Mako eyes, he calls them, the mark of one who made it into the elite soldier program of Shinra's military. This is the setup for our main villain, the head of Shinra coming out to taunt our protagonists personally. A showdown between a mercenary and his former employer. Before leaving, the president unleashes a robo-soldier called the Airbuster to keep our heroes at bay, and so begins our second boss battle. The Airbuster introduces a new type of battle formation to the player, the pincer attack. Cloud starts on one side of the boss, while Barrett and Tifa are on the other. During this fight, you'll probably come to notice that back attacks do double damage, making it quite undesirable to be caught in a pincer attack like this, which may very well happen to our party over the course of the game's runtime. It's a diegetic way of teaching the player about a new gameplay concept, and for that alone, I'd say this fight is rather well designed. But on top of its effectiveness as a teaching tool, the Airbuster itself has some rather devastating attacks at its disposal, dealing between 100 and 200 hit points of damage with an attack called Big Bomber, and counterattacking after every bit of damage the player unleashes against it. You'll have to utilize your newly acquired Restore Materia or several strategically timed potions to keep everyone alive during this fight. It's a good step up, difficulty-wise, from our previous encounters, thus serving to incrementally increase the challenge of the game over time. Once the player defeats the Airbuster, it will explode, destroying the catwalk and causing Cloud to fall from the top plate and down into the Sector 5 slums below. You alright? Can you hear me? Yeah. Back then, you could get by with just skinned knees. What do you mean by back then? What about now? Can you get up? What do you mean by that time? What about now? Don't worry about me. You just worry about yourself now. I'll give it a try. How about that? Take it slow now. Little by little. I know. Hey, who are you? Upon coming to, we see that Cloud's fall was broken by a flower bed within an old abandoned church, tended to by the flower girl we met earlier. Her dialogue changes depending upon your earlier interactions with her, but no matter what you said, she will at least give Cloud her name. Aeris. She's the newest addition to our party, and our main heroine. The next several hours of the game see Cloud and the player both endearing themselves to her character through her quick-witted dialogue and quippy interactions with Cloud. But just as we are beginning to know one another, Shinra troops enter the church. But in a strange turn of events, they're not here for Cloud. They're here for Aeris. She asks Cloud to be her bodyguard and escort her all the way back to her mother's house in exchange for a date, to which Cloud agrees. And so our new task is to get Aeris out of the church and away from her Shinra pursuers. It's here where we're greeted with another small mechanical challenge. Cloud and Aeris get separated in one of the back rooms of the church, and so the only way to assist her is by throwing barrels onto the troops from the top floor. You can also tell Aeris to run away, but if you do this too much, she'll eventually get cornered and be forced to fight all by herself, which can be difficult considering that she has pretty low non-magic skills at the start of the game. So the best case scenario is to avoid conflict altogether. After we escape our Shinra pursuers, Cloud will tell Aeris that the ones who are chasing after her are known as the Turks, a secret arm of the Shinra Defense Department that deals in espionage, assassinations, and kidnapping. Obviously, this would mean that Aeris is a high-value target for the Shinra, but she seems completely oblivious as to whatever reason they might have for seeing her as such. During this conversation, we see the first kindling of a romance between these two ignite. They have a playful, witty dynamic with one another that should quickly endear the player to Aeris. But just as we're beginning to like her, we are forced to say goodbye. We bring Aeris back to her mother's house, just as promised, but upon learning that Cloud doesn't know the way back to Sector 7, she quickly 180s, deciding that she now wants to show Cloud the way back personally. Aeris' mother is reluctant to agree, but asks that we at least stay the night before heading out, to which Aeris assents. But it's at this point that she takes Cloud aside and politely, but firmly, asks him to leave in the middle of the night. This leads to a little minigame where the player will have to quietly sneak out from the guest room on the second floor and past Aeris without making too much noise. This minigame is just absolutely brilliant because it's a perfect example of how a developer should do ludonarrative storytelling in video games. Let me explain. Cloud clearly feels guilty about sneaking out on Aeris. That much is apparent through his dialogue and body posture. But video game storytelling is about so much more than just telling the audience what's happening. As an interactive medium, there really is no better way to convey a story in a video game than to make the player feel what our protagonist is experiencing through gameplay. And boy, does Final Fantasy VII manage to hit that nail straight on the head. forcing the player to sneak out on Aeris, rather than simply adding in a cutscene of Cloud performing the action on his own volition, makes the player feel Cloud's guilt for himself. So when she catches up to us in just a minute and shames Cloud for trying to leave without her, it feels so much more personal. It wasn't just Cloud who was outsmarted by Aeris, it was also the person holding the controller. You, the player, are being shamed by Aeris for thinking you could pull a fast one on her. This establishes a personal, ludonarrative connection between Aeris and the player, not just between her and Cloud. But the game doesn't stop here. Oh no, because the real connection you'll build with Aeris comes not just through this little minigame, but by the vital role she plays in the game's combat. I said earlier that there are no classes in Final Fantasy VII. Rather, the Materia system gives the player the option to customize each party member in any way he or she so wishes, essentially creating custom classes of your own design. But that's not to say that there are not optimal roles for each character to fill. As I said earlier, making Barret a mage is generally inadvisable given his god-awful magic stat. Aeris, on the other hand, well, not only does she have far and away the best magic stat in this entire game, but her limit breaks also differ from every other character's in that they heal the party rather than hurt the enemy. Aeris' starting limit break, for example, is called Healing Wind, and it restores the entire party's HP by quite a lot. And each subsequent limit break of hers will continue in that vein, curing debuffs, reviving fallen party members, and even granting invincibility for the duration of a battle. I know, that sounds overpowered as hell, and that's because it is. Essentially, Aeris is far and away the most useful character in your party. You're going to want to always use her, because she fulfills the role of white mage, or healer, better than any other character in the game. And that's a vital role in a turn-based RPG. You can't neglect to put a healer on your team and expect to have a good time. Aeris is therefore established, purely through gameplay, to be the main heroine of Final Fantasy VII, and a staple feature of any good party makeup for this game. That will, in turn, work to endear the player to her character even further. She's not just a cool, funny girl who Cloud seems to have a crush on, but also a vital member of our team. And as you'll no doubt notice in this footage, it is for those reasons that I will be making great use of Aeris throughout the rest of the game. Once we arrive at the Sector 7 gate, Aeris and Cloud decide to take a little time to get to know each other. Aeris asks what rank Cloud achieved in Soldier, and he says, First Class. Apparently, Aeris had a boyfriend who also made First Class, same as Cloud, but that was many years ago. Cloud seems to remind Aeris a lot of him, which is perhaps why she started taking a liking to him in the first place. The conversation is then interrupted when Cloud spots Tifa in a rather revealing dress, being carted off to Sector 6 in a ridiculously gaudy chocobo-drawn carriage, and so we chase after her and run off to Sector 6. I'm giving this part of the game its own dedicated chapter because it's one of the most unique sections of gameplay I have ever witnessed in a turn-based RPG, and there's a surprising amount of robust checks and balances happening under the hood to unpack here. Tifa has been taken to the mansion of one Don Corneo, a local crime boss who works for the Shinra, keeping tabs on the underbelly of Midgar in exchange for them turning a blind eye to his criminal activities. The Don is currently looking for a wife, or so he says. In reality, he just brings 3 girls to his mansion every night, chooses one to be his bride, bangs her, then continues the cycle the next day. What a life this guy leads. The only way to get into the mansion without making a scene is, therefore, to be invited in as one of the 3 candidates for this impromptu marriage, which Aeris suggests she does in order to contact Tifa. As you can no doubt tell, she's a rather gung-ho girl. Cloud, though, being the voice of reason in this case, protests against her going into a place like this alone. This gives Aeris the brilliant idea to dress Cloud up as a chick so he can sneak in with her, but this is going to be quite difficult given his masculine figure. And so begins our quest to cross-dress Cloud so effectively that he can fool the gate guard into letting him into the mansion. For this entire section of the game, there are no random encounters, no battles, no turn-based combat, none of that. Instead, we take it slow. and explore the seedy underbelly of Sector 6 with Aeris, tracking down a tailor to make Cloud a dress, competing in a squat contest for a wig, picking up a diuretic from the pharmacy to give to a chick stuck in the bathroom to exchange for some perfume, finding some lingerie in a strip club. Yes, these are all real things that you do in this game. I did not make any of that up. The majority of these activities are optional. It's kind of like that part of Link's Awakening where you take Marin out on a date, except much more adult. The one difference between the date in Link's Awakening and Final Fantasy VII is that completing these optional tasks will actually affect the outcome of this quest. You see, once the player has finished dressing up Cloud and makes his way into the mansion, we'll meet up with Tifa, who will explain that Corneo has information on a possible Shinra cleanup operation against Avalanche. As a woman, Tifa figured that entering and winning the bride contest was the easiest way to get in a room alone with the Don so that she could interrogate him. But now, with the three of us in cahoots, our success is guaranteed, and this is where your actions with Aeris just a moment ago begin to matter. Under normal circumstances, Don Corneo likes to pick either Tifa or Aeris, and will drag whichever one he chooses into the back room while you fight through a horde of the Don's guards. But if you completed every optional quest with Aeris, and managed to get the very best of each item, the silk dress, the diamond tiara, the blonde wig, the sexy cologne, and the lingerie, Don Corneo will instead pick Cloud to be his bride for the night. Not only does this allow you to skip the previously mentioned series of fights with the Don's bodyguards, but you'll also get to witness one of the more humorous scenes in the game. It's neat, and adds a lot of variety to the gameplay. It took me a few playthroughs before I finally managed to make Cloud look sexy enough for the Don to choose him, but that's what I like about it. If you find this section humorous, you can play it for all it's got. Or you can just rush through the date and fight the Don's guards instead. It adds a lot of replay value to one of the slower sections of the game, which is quite the commendable feat, I must say. Regardless of how you choose to play this sequence, Don Corneo will eventually reveal the Shinra plans to flatten the entire Sector 7 slums by destroying the supports that hold up the Sector 7 plate above. Then they are going to blame the attack on the terrorists to rally public support for Shinra. Before we can escape, Corneo opens the trapdoor to his Rancor pit, because I guess every fat perverted crime boss just has one of those for some reason. It is here where we are greeted with our third boss battle against a creature called Apps. This is genuinely one of the worst designed boss fights in the game. I know, it's weird that it took me this long into the video before I finally said a negative thing about this game, and it's because of a single shitty boss fight, but that's how reviews work on this channel. I don't leave anything out, and unfortunately, this is the first shitty thing the game throws at you. So let's talk about what exactly went wrong with this fight. Apps has access to the very first water elemental attack we'll see in this game, Tsunami. It hits every character on screen and can do quite decent damage. Sounds like he's a real threat then, right? Yes, he is. To himself, mostly. Because for some fucked up reason, Apps Tsunami hurts everyone in the battle, including himself. And guess what else? It hits him in the back, so it does twice as much damage to him as it does to our party. Wait, no, scratch that. It actually does 4 times as much damage, because for some reason, Apps was programmed to have a weaker back than literally every other enemy in the game. He is the only enemy, as far as I've been able to tell, that has a 400% attack bonus to his back. What this means is that more often than not, Apps will just end up killing himself before the player even realizes what's happening. It's the strangest boss fight in the entire game. I have no idea what the fuck anyone was thinking when they designed this fight. This couldn't have been intentional, right? Like, this had to have been a mistake that no one ended up noticing before the game shipped. Except, the international version of Final Fantasy VII received multiple balancing patches and several pieces of new content. Yet, despite that, this fight has never been fixed. So I have to assume that this is just the original intention of the designer, right? After dealing with that horrible fight, the player will have to make his way back to Sector 7 through the sewers beneath Sector 6, and then through the train graveyard just beyond. There's nothing particularly special here, other than the gorgeous backgrounds, until the very end, where we get the first inklings of some puzzle design in Final Fantasy VII. You'll have to move a few rundown trains to push the local junk around and create a path forward. It's not complex. I know, almost none of the puzzles in this game will even as much approach Zelda levels of dungeon design, but it is inoffensive at the very least, and helps tell a story through the environment. A story of how busy this place must have once been before it became just another slum underneath Midgar, fitting in with Barrett's earlier tales about how each sector used to have names before the crushing march of progress and industrialization sucked any individuality out of the city and its people. If nothing else, the level designs in Final Fantasy VII will at least do an excellent job at conveying the game's themes. But yeah, from a gameplay perspective, there really isn't much going on here. That all changes once we arrive in the Sector 7 slums. Wedge is dead, and ascending the pillar only reveals more corpses. Biggs and Jesse have also fallen. In their final moments, they gave their lives to defend Sector 7 from the Shinra. With her final words, Jesse voices her many regrets about what she did and all the people she hurt. In life, these people were terrorists. They certainly killed a lot of people. There is no doubt about that. But no matter what they did before this point, no matter their past sins, they chose to stand and fight in this moment. With their final act, the members of Avalanche chose to be heroes. They could have fled if they wanted to, and simply left the people of Sector 7 to be crushed beneath the plate above. And yet, they chose to defend this pillar to the last man. But the last man has yet to fall. At Tifa's request, Aeris splits off from the party to go find Marlene and bring her to safety, while she and Cloud ascend the pillar to help fight the Shinra. At the top, we find Barrett still holding out, and join up with him to take on the fourth boss fight against Reno, an agent of the Turks. Reno employs several newly introduced boss mechanics in this fight. With the move Pyramid, he can trap one of our party members in a temporary prison, preventing that character from moving for several turns. You can break this prison by attacking the affected party member, though that will also cost one of your units his or her turn. On top of that, Reno also has a cattle prod that deals shock damage and potentially stuns the target, an additional method through which he can momentarily take one of your party members out of the fight. As a result, Reno's main strategy relies on reducing the amount of DPS your party can inflict on him, while slowly wearing down their HP over time, which is a particularly effective strategy if he manages to take your dedicated healer out of the fight for a few turns. All in all, Reno does an excellent job of introducing key mechanics that later bosses will make decent use of, while also serving as a formidable challenge in his own right. But defeating Reno does not bring our heroes victory, as one might expect it would. Aeris has been captured, and the bomb goes off regardless of our efforts to stop it. Our lives are only saved by some quick thinking on Barrett's part, but the aftermath is brutal. Avalanche is no more. Sector 7 is gone. Barrett yells out for his fallen comrades and fires his gun at the debris in anger. His grief is palpable. All those lives, the lives of his neighbors, his friends, his comrades in Avalanche, are lost forever, never to return. I want to take a moment here to say that this part of the game, this scene right here, was where I first realized the potential this game's story had. No punches were pulled here. We didn't do some goofy, let's save the town type of adventure. We're not pretending like Avalanche was above reproach. We're not retroactively bringing people back from the dead. No, the whole of Sector 7 was just wiped out. Tens of thousands of people are dead. Biggs, Wedge, Jesse, they're gone. Those characters are dead forever. They're never coming back. That should be obvious, I know, but with how many modern storytellers continue to pussy out of actually killing off their characters, I feel like that was a subject that needed to be broached. Death is absolute. It's quite literally life's only absolute. So for a writer to chicken out and bring a character back from the dead is just... it's the worst. I cringe every time I see it done in any story. It's just complete crap. It ruins any tension or believability that your tale may have otherwise had. How can I be expected to believe anything the author has to say when they've already betrayed my trust by breaking life's only rule? That it ends. All of that is to say that Final Fantasy VII won't pull any punches in regards to character deaths. When I tell you that someone dies in this story, that's absolute. Though we might have lost most of our comrades in this last battle, Aeris did at least manage to fulfill her promise and bring Marlene back to safety at her mother's house in Sector 6. Once we arrive, Aeris' mother tells us that the Shinra took her daughter because of what she is, an ancient, the original inhabitants of the planet, said to be able to locate the Promised Land, a place of supreme happiness. Shinra wants her for obvious reasons, i.e. they think there might be a bunch of Mako energy in the Promised Land and they plan to exploit it all for profit. Aeris has managed to avoid capture for years because the Shinra were never willing to physically harm her, but she was caught this time because Marlene slowed her down. This revelation causes Barrett to feel incredible guilt, and apologize profusely to Aeris' mother. She shames the man, questioning why he would ever do something so stupid like become a terrorist when he has a daughter, and Barrett almost seems to agree with her for a moment. He feels shame for having left his daughter like that, but he knows he has to fight. He feels as though it's the right thing to do because he wants to save the planet from disaster. But right now, he doesn't give a shit about any of that. He doesn't make excuses or refute the woman in any way. He just wants to hold his daughter and know that she's alright. Flat out, love this. It's a very humanizing moment for Barrett. We already witnessed a snippet of this side of him from his earlier interactions with his daughter, but to see Barrett completely drop the tough guy act and prioritize his daughter's safety after losing so many of his friends today really does highlight his inner humanity. Yes, he kills people. He's done terrible things, absolutely, but he loves his daughter more than anything. He wouldn't know what to do without her because she's the reason he's even fighting in the first place, and that's really quite evident in this moment. A man who's willing to drop everything to make sure his daughter is safe is a man with a good heart somewhere deep down. And this is only the beginning of Barrett's wonderfully written character development, which I cannot wait to talk about more as we move on with the game. Cloud and Tifa feel terrible for dragging Aeris into this mess as well, and Barrett believes that he owes her a debt for saving his daughter's life. And so, the three of us head off to free Aeris from the Shinra headquarters in the heart of Midgar. The Shinra building is perhaps what we could call this game's first dungeon, if you consider anything in Final Fantasy VII to be a dungeon, that is. It's not quite as easy to define in this game as it was in, say, the first 6 Final Fantasy games, or a Zelda game for that matter. But fundamentally, this area of the game is comprised of many of the same gameplay elements that one would expect to find in traditional RPG dungeons. Focused game design, linear sections, puzzle solving, concentrated story elements, the whole 9 yards. One of the very best things about the Shinra building is in its gameplay variety. Right off the bat, the player is provided with 2 choices for breaking into the building: the front entrance or the fire escape. Choose the front entrance and you'll have to fight scores of Shinra guards, as you would rightfully expect. But this can earn the party some extra experience points and allow the player to explore the lower levels of the building, in which lie several items and little secrets. Choosing the fire escape, on the other hand, will skip over all of that and provide one of the funniest scenes of dialogue in the entire game, in which you'll physically drag Cloud and company up 59 flights of stairs and witness Tifa use some very 90s insults. It's a hilarious experience. I suggest trying it at least once. Regardless of how the player chooses to ascend these first 59 floors, the final 11 will constitute the slower, more methodical part to the Shinra building's level design. Floor 60 is host to a small minigame that challenges your skills with timing. You need to sneak Cloud past a couple Shinra guards by hiding behind these statues, then command Tifa and Barret to cross at just the right times in order to not get caught. If you are caught, then you'll be ambushed by several enemies in a pincer attack, which, as we discussed previously, is a most disfavorable position to find yourself in. You can either force your way through the minigame and fight scores of guards, or successfully sneak past them. The choice is yours. Floor 61, by contrast, requires simple investigation of the environment to ascend through. Talking to this NPC and passing yourself off as maintenance will result in him giving you access to Floor 62. Here lies the mayor's office. Talking to the man himself reveals that he is actually nothing more than a mere librarian, keeping Shinra's records in order while the company wields the real power in the city. He agrees to just hand over his own keycard if you simply guess what his computer password is. He also offers a bonus prize on top of that, should the player guess it right on the first try. He's even hidden the clues to finding the password within the archives. Clearly, this guy has way too much time on his hands. You now have two choices to make at this point. One, you could forego the puzzle altogether and simply guess down the list of passwords until you get the right one. Or 2, you can try to solve this puzzle on the first go-around in order to receive a bonus prize. To do this without any help would be quite difficult, since his code is rather complicated. You see, within these 4 sections of the archives, the Science Division, Weapon Research and Development, the Space Program, and Urban Development, there will be one out-of-place numbered document. The number coincides with the clue. For example, if I found document number 4, ranks and extended use of Mako weaponry, within the Science section, when it really should be in the Weapon Research and Development section, then I would simply need to look at the number, 4, and then take the 4th letter in the book title, K in this case, and bam, that's our first clue. Repeat this step 3 more times and you'll have the answer. Mako, in my case. This is quite the complex puzzle, I know. You can't expect the majority of players to figure this crap out on the first time without any hints. I sure as hell couldn't, but that's where the deputy mayor comes in. You can bribe him for several clues to the puzzle. This is incredibly expensive, mind you, but the better you are at taking the hints he gives, the less bribes you'll have to purchase. This puzzle also has great replay value, since the answer's randomized. It won't always be Mako, as it was in my recorded playthrough. It might be Bomb or Hojo, for example. So you can't just get it right by immediately looking up the answer or remembering it from an earlier playthrough. The puzzle needs to be solved again on every new playthrough of the game. Personally, I find that it's always worth my time playing the mayor's little game, since the prize is the rare elemental materia, rewarding players who take the time and invest the effort to solve the mayor's puzzle on the first try. Regardless of whether you decide to participate in the mayor's game or not, you'll eventually receive his keycard, which allows you to ascend the next 3 floors uninhibited. Floor 63 is also host to a puzzle, but one which is completely optional, unlike the last. The entire floor is filled to the brim with locked doors, of which you're only allowed to open a maximum of 3 at a time. Within this maze lies 3 coupons, which you can exchange for several prizes. A star pendant, which is an accessory that prevents the poison status, a piece of armor with 4 materia slots, and another all support materia. Okay, sounds simple enough. Just solve the puzzle 3 times to collect all 3 coupons, right? Well, here's the catch. You can only turn in the coupons once, and you can't reset the doors without giving up any coupons you've already picked up. So if you want all 3 prizes, you're going to have to find a way to collect all 3 coupons in one go. Or, alternatively, you could just go for the one prize you care about the most. Or, again, you can skip this section entirely. The choice is yours, and I really love that about the Shinra building. Most of the loot comes in the form of solving optional puzzles like this one, which adds a lot of choice and replay value to what is otherwise a really long section of the game. Above here lies the 68th floor, which holds the company gym. Here, the player is allowed to rest and save his progress before moving on. Just above, on the 65th floor, is our final puzzle of the dungeon. A giant model replica of Midgar sits in the center of the room, and the player will have to find the correct pieces in treasure chests spread throughout the floor and fit them back into the model. It's definitely the weakest puzzle by far, since it doesn't require any actual thought. Just find the unlocked chest and fit it into any open slot within the model. Nothing groundbreaking, but it isn't offensive either. Completing this puzzle will open the way to the 66th floor, where the boardroom is located. The front door is locked, but talking to the Shinra employees will reveal the existence of an air duct in the bathroom, through which we can eavesdrop on the company executives. Here we meet Professor Hojo, the head of the Shinra Science Department, who we learn is currently holding Aeris hostage in his lab. So now we have to shadow Hojo up to the 67th floor, where we find... Huh? Sorry, blacked out there for a second. Anyway, we arrive on the 68th floor to find Hojo in the middle of concluding an experiment on Aeris and a strange orange beast, who promptly attacks Hojo the moment we free the two of them from captivity. This is our newest addition to the party, Red 13. Red 13 is a mysterious and incredibly intelligent creature with high dexterity and decent magic and attack stats. He starts with a fire and sense materia, so he's a rather useful party member here at the start of the game. You can then choose either Tifa or Barret to stand and fight alongside you for our 5th boss battle against one of Hojo's test subjects, sample H0512. This is the first boss enemy in the game to be accompanied by minions, as well as the first one to take full advantage of sitting in the back row, meaning that physical attacks will only do half damage to it. On top of that, he is also the first enemy to inflict status effects on our party, in this case, poison. This can be a big problem, of course, but if you picked up that star pendant from the puzzle on the 63rd floor and equipped it to one of your party members, then he or she will be immune to the effects of poison, allowing him or her to continue the fight unaffected. It's quite smart of the developers to have made sure that the prizes the player receives for completing the optional content within this dungeon matches up with the later challenges present in that same dungeon. It's good game design, and it appropriately rewards players for going out of their way to solve these puzzles, as any good optional content should. As for the boss himself, not only will he absorb any poison damage you try inflicting upon him, but he will also have lightning damage, so experimentation, or key use of Red 13's sense materia, will be quite helpful in determining which spells will work best on him. On top of that, the minions can be revived by their master once each, so going for the squishies first is quite inadvisable. Your best strategy is to use ice or fire spells on the main boss in the back row while completely ignoring the minions. All in all, it's a good fight. It teaches the player the importance of paying attention to elemental matchups, and introduces negative status effects, such as poison, two concepts that will make frequent appearances in the many boss battles that are yet to come. After the battle's conclusion, the player can begin making his descent back down to the 66th floor elevator. But surprise, the Turks were here waiting for us. Cloud and company are caught, and the president makes a grandiose speech to us about his plans to exploit the Promised Land, and how he will use Aeris to find it. As an ancient, or Cetra as they called themselves, she has the ability to literally speak with the planet, which is apparently the method through which the Cetra would traditionally locate the Promised Land. We're then thrown into prison, and though it sucks that we've been recaptured, Aeris is still quite grateful that Cloud came to her rescue. Tifa asks what the Promised Land even is, but Aeris doesn't really have an answer. Her mother's hints were supposedly cryptic at best, and the voice of the planet is loud and difficult to sift through for answers. At this point, you can check on how the rest of the party is doing, or just go to bed and wait until your inevitable fate. Either way, Cloud will eventually wake up to find this. Everything is dead. Trudging through the bloody path of whatever monster caused this calamity reveals that Genova, the creature we saw in Hojo's lab, has broken free. Could this be our culprit? Ascending to the top floor reveals the answer. The president is dead. He is not our true antagonist. The sword which pierced his body is immediately identified by Cloud and Tifa. It belongs to a man called Sephiroth. Final Fantasy VII media post this game's initial release in 1997 has oversaturated the ever-living shit out of Sephiroth. Dunkey had a particularly apt criticism of the Final Fantasy VII Remake's treatment of this character, which is that the writer for that game had zero restraint in showing off Sephiroth. Almost as if the game's director had a fucking hard-on for him or something. I don't know. Oh, is this Tetsuya Nomura? Oh, what is he doing here? Point being, if you've never played Final Fantasy VII before, but have heard of it through general cultural osmosis, then you've probably been thinking to yourself for the past hour, when is this Octorok guy finally going to mention Sephiroth? And, well, I did that on purpose. I've been pretending as though President Shinra was the main antagonist the whole time, and I did that because, Well, that's what the game itself does, and quite deftly too, I must say. It sets President Shinra, some generic corporate overlord, up to be the main villain of the game, but then pulls a 180 right here in this exact scene. This is Sephiroth's grand reveal. Before this moment, Sephiroth's name gets thrown around a grand total of 5 times, and every time anyone talks about him, you will have no idea who this guy was, just that people once admired him long ago, but now don't. The implication being that he's dead. And that was, in fact, believed to be the case. As you'll no doubt gather based on Tifa, Cloud, and the one remaining witness's dialogue, Sephiroth was believed to be dead before this moment. And yet, we now know that he was definitely here, his sword skewering the president through his own desk. Undeniable proof that the man himself is alive and going after the Shinra. Barrett logically assumes that this makes the man our ally. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, after all. But Cloud immediately refutes this, saying that he knows Sephiroth, and therefore knows that the man is up to something more. This is our first concrete proof of there being a personal history between these two characters, a plot point which will be expanded upon greatly as we continue through the game. Moments later, a helicopter arrives just outside the 70th floor. It's the late president's son, Rufus Shinra. Rufus immediately assumes his father's role, not even taking a moment to mourn the man's passing. With sudden conviction, Cloud declares that this is the true fight for the future of the planet, stopping Sephiroth and Shinra from reaching the Promised Land, and asks everyone else to leave while he fights Rufus alone. What ensues is 2 separate boss battles fought consecutively by the player, the first of which utilizes a party comprised of Aeris, Barrett, and Red 13 as they try to escape the Shinra building via the elevator. You're given a chance to remove Tifa and Cloud's materia and rearrange the current party's loadout before heading to the elevator for the 6th boss fight against the Gunners. This battle is quite unique for 2 reasons. One, the enemy lies across a chasm, meaning that only magic, limit breaks, and Barrett's gun arm will do any damage to him. Secondly, there are actually 2 bosses to fight here, one after the other. The first is against the 100 Gunner. Like all other Shinra robots, it is weak to lightning damage, but it has a lot more health points than any of the other bosses we've gone up against so far. He uses long-range physical attacks and will become increasingly stronger the more you whittle down his health. Once he's defeated, the next boss takes his place, the Heli Gunner. While the 100 Gunner only utilize normal physical attacks, the Heli Gunner will seek to inflict sleep or poison status effects on individual party members, potentially taking one or multiple of your units out of commission for several turns, while also sapping them of health over time. Smart materia placement is key to winning this fight. If you don't give Aeris or Red 13 any magic materia, for example, then they won't be able to inflict any damage for the duration of this battle. Setting up Aeris and Red 13 with the proper spells, and perhaps even combining an all and restore materia to heal your party quickly with, is key to victory. This ups the ante from our previous boss battles, and demands that the player understand the materia system to a greater extent. Incremental difficulty at its best. Following this battle is a one-on-one duel between Cloud and Rufus. This isn't a gimmick fight, by the way. It's actually the first of several one-on-one type boss battles that we'll see throughout the game. You can switch out Cloud's gear and materia before beginning the fight, but other than that small comfort, you'll have to figure out the best strategy for yourself here. You can't expect to brute force this one. Rufus is built to last. His hound, Dark Nation, will cast several supportive spells on the President, such as Barrier and Magic Barrier, which, respectively, have incoming physical and magical damage. So simple DPS isn't going to work here. You need to either strategically kill off Dark Nation before he can protect his master, or cast support spells of your own to outlast Rufus. There are 2 ways to do this. Use your newly acquired poison materia to inflict the associated status effect on him, or equip a restore materia and continuously cast cure on yourself. A last resort could be the item command. Assuming you saved up a decent number of potions, you could theoretically outlast Rufus this way too. There are several strategies to employ here, and this fight will hardly ever play out the same way twice because of that. It's a decent boss battle, and introduces these one-on-one type duels quite deftly. The new President Shinra will flee before you can finish him off, and you'll then resume control of Cloud as he and Tifa escape the Shinra building together. What follows is the very first vehicle segment of the game. Yes, first, there will be many of these, and most of them suck. This one, though, is actually pretty okay. The player is given control of Cloud on a motorcycle, using the D-pad to move. The goal is to swat away your Shinra pursuers by using the square and circle buttons to swing Cloud's Buster Sword with. You have to protect the car holding your fellow party members, as well as Cloud himself, because the health bars shown at the top left actually coincide with the character's hit points. The worse a job you do at protecting the party, the less health they'll have to work with as you fight off the boss waiting for you at the end of the highway. Motorball. The fight begins with the motorball charging the party from behind, doing double damage in the process. The battle lines, therefore, will begin reversed, since this counts as a back attack. In other words, you'll be completely caught off guard, and will have to shift your character's positions accordingly if you want the party to resume their proper battle positions. Having a dedicated healer will benefit the player greatly during this section, since the party will have to spend the first turn or two simply recuperating from the motorball's opening move. It's a good fight, and it's quite clever that the devs had it connect with the earlier vehicle section. The better a job you did at protecting the party during the minigame, the more health you start this boss fight with. It's a very smart way to create a connection between the game's action sequences and the turn-based combat. None of the other vehicle sections in this game are going to do that, so let's just enjoy this while we can. Upon escaping from our Shinra pursuers, the party determines that the time has come to leave Midgar and chase after Sephiroth. It is at this point that a major shift in the game's pacing occurs. No longer are we traveling through linear sections of tight urban city structures. Now the game's overworld has finally opened up to us, and the player is allowed a much larger degree of autonomy in how he chooses to traverse it. The overworld of Final Fantasy VII is quite similar to that of most other turn-based RPGs from before the 2000s. Although, since I've never talked about any turn-based RPGs on my channel before, it's probably best that I describe exactly what that precedent entails. Essentially, the player is given free control over a large 3D model of Cloud meant to represent the party as they travel through the game world. Along the way, random encounters may occur, forcing the player to fight or flee. From this overworld, the player can choose to either travel towards the next story event or search for optional content, both of which are represented by little 3D models of locations within the overworld. By traveling to these models, the player will be thrust into a location such as a town, cave, or dungeon, where the gameplay once again returns to a 2D axis atop pre-rendered backgrounds, much like in Midgar. Of course, there are some limits placed on your range of exploration, but they're at least made to feel diegetic. Rather than simply being arbitrarily gated off from exploration, as is often the case with lazier RPGs, Final Fantasy has always done quite a decent job at making sure that the reasons for your current travel trajectory are connected with the current context of the story. And Final Fantasy VII in particular does quite a good job with this. Most of the game's overworld travel is limited by vehicles. If you acquire the necessary vehicle, you could theoretically skip over many of the game's required story sections, which is generally the mark of a well-designed progression system. You want to make sure that the actual tangible upgrades that the player receives are making a difference, and the vehicles of Final Fantasy VII do just that, by opening up more and more of the game world as the player progresses through the story. That being said, I do think that the overworld of Final Fantasy VII can feel a bit empty at times. Don't get me wrong, I love this game and its world design, and every location in Final Fantasy VII is designed with so much rich detail and fun content that I truly do think it's quite commendable, especially for a studio that had never made a 3D game before. But, I mean, Wutai. This place is said to be a nation with a rich history that Shinra spent many years warring against until finally subjugating it. And yet, it's only one village according to this game? And don't get me wrong, if that were part of the story, like if Wutai had suffered some terrible genocide and all that was left was this tiny hamlet, then that would be okay. But that's not what happened. No one makes any mention of that. Rather, the locals are upset that Wutai has become a tourist trap. No one's upset about the loss of people or territory, as far as I can tell. So I have to conclude that this is simply a case of ludonarrative dissonance. The game's telling me one thing, but showing me another. It's like that Breath of the Wild example all over again. Of course, this is a rare problem in Final Fantasy VII. Case in point, Wutai was really my only major example. Still, there are some minor aspects to the world building that I don't think are perfectly addressed, such as what role world governments play in Shinra's activities. Midgar was well thought out in that regard. We see Reeves, the head of urban development for Shinra, making all the executive decisions regarding the city, collecting estimates for building projects, and planning the construction of new infrastructure, while the mayor acts as nothing more than a librarian, his very existence only serving to publicly pretend as though this city has a democratic process. It's brilliant stuff, but what about Costa del Sol, or Junon, or Coral? What country did these settlements originally belong to before Shinra took over? They could not have all been locally governed. Midgar is large enough for me to believe that it was once a city-state in its own right, but not Coral. This place could not have survived on its own. They didn't even grow food here. It was a coal mining town before the Shinra arrived. So who were their previous masters? Who did they pay taxes to? Who did they trade with for food and other essentials? Is any of this stuff a major issue? Not really. These are tiny details which we can try to fill in for ourselves, after all. Perhaps there are local mayors, presidents, or princes which we never meet, who the Shinra use as their political puppets, just like in Midgar. But even so, if these people do exist, then it's up to the writers to make that known. It's not the audience's job to create headcanons that patch up holes in the story. No matter what Rian Johnson tells you, I shouldn't be questioning who's in charge of each town I visit in the overworld. It should be evident through dialogue, visual storytelling, and even the gameplay. If there's nothing to indicate the existence of a local government or national identity, then does it even exist? Let me give you an example of what I'm looking for here. Throughout the game, there are some Shinra independent settlements that we'll encounter, and the writers do a good job of letting the player know how each of these places stays afloat. Fort Condor is inhabited exclusively by men of fighting age, since they're actively fighting a war with the Shinra over the reactor. They sent their wives and children away and have resigned themselves to their fate. This is not a permanent settlement. North Coral is so poor and underpopulated that Shinra doesn't even care to govern it. The people survive by scavenging junk technology in the mountains and trading with tourists who travel to the Gold Saucer. Their favorable geography for trade allows them to survive, even with as shitty a hand as they've been dealt in life. Gonganga is an eco-socialist commune that was radicalized after Shinra's local Mako reactor exploded, killing half the village's population. They're extremely poor as a result of their current economic system, but they're okay with that because they've been scarred by the worst of what economic and industrial progress has to offer. This is good environmental storytelling, some of the best that the game has to offer even, but it stands in stark contrast to other settlements in the game which seem to have zero purpose or history behind them. Take this town in the north, for example. It's called Icicle Inn. That's not even a town name. That just describes a single business located within the town. Does anyone run this place? Does Shinra even have a presence here? Does this settlement produce anything of any value to anyone? Not as far as I can tell. It is, by far and large, the most underwritten location in the entire game. What I'm trying to get across here is this. On the one hand, Final Fantasy VII has some of the best writing I've ever seen in a video game before, and its well thought out setting and lifelike environments really enhances that writing. But if there's one area of the game where that illusion begins to crack at times, it's out here in the overworld. It's a relatively minor problem in comparison to the greater product that is Final Fantasy VII, but it's a problem that exists all the same. And so I thought I would at least point it out here. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. This was part 1 of a 4-part series critiquing Final Fantasy VII. I've never tried this split format before, but I thought if any review warranted it, it would be the one that's pushing almost 8 hours of runtime, holy shit. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm happy to tell you that the next part will be out pretty soon. I know, that's strange by my channel standards, but I originally wrote this review as a single video, so the only part that isn't done is the editing. The rest is already researched and written, so I think you can expect part 2 to come out in about, 3 weeks? Something like that. I hope you enjoyed part 1, and if so, feel free to subscribe so you can be notified when the next 3 parts come out, but regardless, thank you all so much for watching this long video of mine. I truly do appreciate it, and have yourselves a very nice day.